Okay, so I've just power watched Netflix's new Gamestop documentary, Eat the Rich, to see how they'd approach it, how much of the story they'd get right, and how much they would focus on the wackiness and the narrative from the trailer. And, well, it's not good news. But before I continue, please like and especially subscribe to my channel. It would really help out. Let me get my biases out of the way. I've been investing for a good while now, and I'm a bit of a geek, so what I want in a documentary like this is going to be different to a lot of people. I want to see how the investment thesis was discovered and managed. I want to see the drama of people holding through the lows and the elation of the highs. I want to see clever people actually do clever things. I want to learn. Secondly, I actually researched the events around the GameStop squeeze thoroughly. I even wrote up a script to cover the event, but I went so in-depth on it and took so long to do it properly that I didn't think people would actually be interested by the time I finished, because so many people had already done kind of surface-deep YouTube videos on it, while I was actually doing things like recreating Deep Effing Value's entire trade in an Excel sheet to see what his actual unreported highs and lows were. So this kind of semi-zany take, interviewing people that essentially didn't know what they were doing when investing, is a bit unsatisfying to me. But the vast bulk of people that heard about GME or invested in it are like the people in the documentary, and just liked the stock and the story. No shade, it's a cool story. I'm just interested in a different part of the story. So I have to try and set my biases aside and assume most people are there for the narrative that I find annoying. The one they really play into, the Main Street versus Wall Street, YOLO takedown capitalism one. So let's get into it. Man, what a hazy 2 years it's been. They start the first episode by reminding us that the build-up to the GameStop squeeze largely happened during COVID, which is good, because after the last two, I barely know what year it is. They do this, however, to bring the economic effects of COVID into a GFC, Occupy Wall Street type narrative. It was a popular one at the time, with the squeeze even called Occupy Wall Street 2.0 by some overzealous journalists, trying to recontextualize the event into something readers have a touchstone for, but inheriting all the political issues that come with it. Eddie Koo, who seems like a pretty cool guy, talks about the hardships of COVID and his wife losing her job. It will be a familiar story to most people who didn't just get to work from home and take advantage of the stimulus while being fully employed. They go into the effects of the GFC and the bank bailout to draw a line between the two events.
And I remember asking my boss at the time, how will the public ever forgive us for the bailout?
But they do it without ever mentioning that with TARP, the US government actually got most of that money back, as they generally took preferred stock in the companies that were bailed out, which they sold later on for a profit. You know how people say capitalism privatizes the gains and socializes the losses? Well, the government essentially semi-nationalized the banks. It was about as Che Guevara as a US government has gotten in the past half-century. Although, once inflation is taken into account, it looks like they didn't make an inflation-adjusted profit. But the point is that TARP wasn't a free gift. Yes, the rich got richer, but it's largely that they already have the capital set aside to take advantage of market lows. This isn't a defense of the government response. A lot more people in the financial industry should have gone to jail over the GFC, and only about 10% of the response went to people on Main Street. People rightly think it was unfair. But a market crashing and then going up is always going to favour people with money put aside. I mean, we're currently in a bear market right now. Rich people will have money to put in at wherever it bottoms, if they're not already actively shorting it on the way down. But it's something literally everyone is technically capable of doing. And please don't take this as a defense of the rich. I only say this because one of my pet peeves is people propagating learned helplessness. It's partially why I started this channel. Now, this certainly isn't investment advice, but it's not the 80s. Anyone can sign up to a provider and short to their heart's content all the way down, and then get degenerate levels of margin to gamble all the way up again, should they want to risk their money. But the rich will always have more money to do the same thing. And my main issue with tying COVID with the GFC is that firstly, the COVID crisis wasn't created by financial institutions, but more importantly, this time around, people on Main Street really did get bailed out. It might not feel like it to people that dodged some of the support, like Neo dodging bullets. I was one of them. Government support went flying past my head. But the US response was actually very generous. It consistently ranks near the top of developed nations by spending to GDP. For some reason, people only remember the stimulus checks. But maybe that's because they didn't have kids for the enhanced child tax credit, or weren't on the super dole, or didn't really feel any benefit of the rent and student loan repayment freezes. None of this is to say that the response was perfect or fair, of course. The PPP loans should have had an F-ton more oversight. But if you honestly take a step back from the us versus them narrative, COVID was one of the first times the people on Main Street were really supported and actually got more than Wall Street and small business put together. And that's without taking the chunk of the PPP loans that actually went to the workers. There were a lot of headlines about the rich getting richer. But again, it was mostly to do with them already having a ton of money to buy the COVID-induced stock market dip. It was a relatively obvious trade. The other thing that bugs me about this framing is that it completely ignores that people were literally putting their COVID stimmy checks into GME, which, don't get me wrong, is based as hell. But they're setting up this us versus them, David versus Goliath, unfair struggle. But the Davids were getting bailouts and using it to invest. Small amounts, sure, but it's kind of pandering, isn't it? I guess that's the audience though. They're describing the general feeling and how people see themselves, and it's probably true for most of the people that joined the trade late after seeing it framed that way on the news. But even Andrew Left, one of the hedge fund managers in the documentary, objects to being called a Goliath and says he's a David fighting Goliaths. We're all the authors of our own story. I'm not saying the rich aren't getting richer, and it's not unfair. I'm just saying it's not all doom and gloom, and there are things you can do about it. It just bugs me that the chaotic, neutral, amoral degenerates that found and set up the trade are forced into this narrative. It airbrushes over some of the more interesting nuance and feels like it's telling people things are hopelessly unfair and there isn't a lot you can do about it. I know it's to set up the idea that people did do something about it by joining the Gamestop squeeze, but it's not the same thing, especially given how it ended. Anyways, they feature a hedge fund manager, and as they are the popular villains of the story, they zoom in on a model jet in his office, presumably to make him come across very let them eat cake, and although there is a turn in his story later, they completely, utterly, and probably intentionally ignore that the whole GME squeeze trade started with a hedge fund manager. No shade to Jeff Amazon, who is the most legit of the GME longs interviewed here. But there were multiple earlier squeeze theses. Deep Effing Value himself used the word on Reddit well before, and incredibly, Michael Burry isn't mentioned once, and the guy both saw the potential and tried to create a short squeeze in GME literally single-handedly over a year before all of this happened. Man. They really focus on Bloomberg terminals versus what you have at home, as though it's us against them, and not the reality that it's every person for themselves. Yes, there are larger players in the market that operate on different rules, of course. But you don't have to beat them. They're not the final boss in a video game. You just have to beat some of the other players. And any human connected to the internet can find information a Bloomberg terminal doesn't have. For instance, I downloaded topographic maps of an oil and gas prospect a company was drilling from a government website that archives all that information, traced them in Adobe Animate, and made them into 3D to see what share of the prospect the companies had across 2 permits with different ownerships. You think a Bloomberg terminal has that information? I'm not a petroleum geologist, I'm just some guy. Until I published it on my channel, it was probably only me and the companies involved that knew who would own how much and therefore how much money might go to each company. They really want us to go all in on this us versus them narrative. And I guess it's TV media. Stories work better with good guys and bad guys, cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians. But it devalues the far more interesting truth that someone can and did find something that few other people saw and made money with it. That's kind of the whole crux of much of this. The people toiling on with total belief in their thesis. Now, I'd better back up a bit, as I'm realizing how annoying it is to me while I'm getting into it like this. So, while watching, it's a fairly cruisy experience. It's edited and produced well. Yes, there are a ton of memes, and the documentary makers manufacturing a new one with Jim Cramer's face on a dog's ass comes across a bit cringe, but that's the nature of the medium now. I won't fault them too much for that. Wall Street Bets was definitely a story of memes. It would be a crime not to lean in hard on them. And props for recognizing Richard Dawkins as the originator of the word too. I actually met him once and gave him a They Might Be Giants CD because he complained in one of his books that no one writes songs about evolution. Anyways. It's also a bit of a shame that they didn't investigate the culture of Wall Street Bets a bit more. Wall Street Bets are absolutely fine shorting and weren't particularly against hedge funds, so long as they were on the same side of the bet. Or they were before the massive influx of new people crowded out the old guard at the time. They also weren't political. They just wanted to make money, and they were mostly smart people acting dumb. But everyone in the documentary is rolled up into the David side of things, and we don't really get a lot of that nuance. I actually really enjoyed the segment in the second episode where the reporter tracked down Keith Gill of Roaring Kitty Deep Effing Value fame. It was an insight I wasn't aware of and an unvarnished look from a third party into the situation, peeking through his window with his beater car in the yard at him playing with his daughter, a new multimillionaire while things are going nuts around him. Although it was a bit much to fake out pretend he might be the bad guy, flashing his picture up when they talk about possible bad people behind the scenes. What's sad though is that in a 3-part series on people finding a unique investment thesis that amazingly became one of the largest financial stories of the decade is that we don't see a single bit about how anyone investigated it. We get a reporter looking up LLCs associated with Roaring Kitty to find his real name, but not anyone looking up securities exchange filings to find out that Michael Burry is buying GameStop and reading his letters to the board that seem to want to initiate a squeeze. Why am I really getting into this intrepid reporter digging through documents bit? And why are there no scenes of investors doing the same thing? Is it just that we've seen journalists looking through records or police looking for shell company owners on TV and we're used to small, discrete bits of paper shuffling? And investing can be a lot of numbers and spreadsheets and that might be boring or something? Maybe? Maybe they're right. It just sucks that I was drawn into this small investigation while surrounded with a tsunami of possible investment investigation that could have maybe also been cut down into bite-sized chunks too. We do get Ben Affleck after Good Will Hunting doesn't get into the car and he gives up his rock-smashing job to become a rapper though.
What up? I'm Mikey Guggenheim.
It's no Tandyman sea shanty, and from the scuff mark on their asses from the paint, it looks like they had to do multiple takes of their song. But it turns out the dude was one of the smarter investors out of the bunch and 10-bagged his initial investment, so how's them apples? They also kind of do him dirty a bit here because the version over the end credits is actually good. Interviews are interspersed with scenes from a Reddit mod's basement as one of the few non-speaking roles. I wonder if they knew there would be literal Cheeto dust involved when the casting call came. It's a touch on the nose. Speaking of which, Ritalin for pure posting fuel? The combined medication for all the diseases Mr. Burns had? I need to know more. They do go into some of the mechanics of the squeeze, but don't complicate things by truly investigating it. I mean, from the graph, it almost looks like Elon Musk is the main driver. I have my suspicion it was another single tweet that initiated it, but I won't mention it just in case I do my own geeky commentary. Also, in reality, it doesn't look like the squeeze was a pure squeeze, due to the volume traded, which was many times the float. It was probably a combined short and gamma squeeze from all the options buying too. They flash on screen that Keith made $47 million. As an absolute nerd that recreated the history of his entire investment, at one point, for a few moments at least, he was up significantly more than that. The series ends on a more serious note, and it's harder to fault some of it. They don't lean too hard into conspiracies. They showed Maxine Waters in the same fine form as she was in her heavyweight bout with Michael Tracy while grilling Robinhood's CEO on the removal of the buy button. But with a more somber tone, the participants we've watched so far describe their wins and losses. I feel bad for a TikToker. some of these people got caught up in the very narrative that the documentary is pushing and lost money or came out slightly behind. I can't help but feel that the media and all the people that called it a fight against Wall Street aren't exactly the least involved in bringing these people to the trade. It turns out that the hedge fund manager from earlier with the model jet actually swooped in to save AMC in a Goliath joining the side of David story. But there is no mention of all the funds that made absolute bank on the long side of the GME squeeze. They make it sound like it's unknowable and shadowy, instead of easy to find all of the institutions that made a lot of money. At least Andrew Left comes across eminently sensible throughout the whole thing. Jim Cramer too, for all his antics. So, okay, will people enjoy this documentary? Probably. It's well made. And if you're not someone that geeked out on it already, you'll probably find it a cruisy and lightly entertaining watch. If you're someone that might get the gel man amnesia effect, and for the love of God, they've got to change the name of that because it takes me 10 minutes of Googling to remember it every damn time I want to describe reading an article or watching a documentary on something you know well so you see all the things they got wrong. Well, maybe it might annoy you the way it annoyed me. But again, I mostly wanted to see smart people doing smart things. Like a less fancy version of The Big Short, I guess, where you got taken through the process of finding a trade and how it went down. And it's not that. Even Jeff Amazon, the one person in the documentary who saw and understood the trade early, doesn't really go into how he found it and understood it. It comes across like he just did some Googling of financial terms and it sprung out fully formed. But hey, it's still probably more enjoyable to more people than anything a novice YouTuber like myself could make. And I don't like tearing down someone else's creation. It's just the someone is wrong on the internet is very strong in me, and I've had to, well, actually a bit. So, enjoy it for what it is. But if you want a more geeked out timeline of how everything actually went down, with stuff like how the trade actually started and propagated, how low and how high Deep Effing Value's portfolio actually went, because it's not in the Wall Street Bet updates, how Wall Street Bets changed during that time period as normies came in, how the squeeze actually looks to have developed, and so on, let me know by commenting below. It probably wouldn't take too long to do from the point I left it at. But it'll just be me. No bells, no whistles, and no rapping at all, I'm afraid. So please like and subscribe and comment below. It would really help out. And I'll see you next time on Stockle.